Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Okay, so you've sent us a really interesting set of sources this time around.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, they compare Hitler's Germany and Castro's Cuba.
Okay.
And on the surface, you don't usually see these two regimes mentioned in the same breath,
Right.
do you? I mean, they had very different ideologies, very different contexts.
Yeah,
But
totally different.
is that the whole story? I'm ready to dive into these sources and see what we find.
Yeah, it's a fascinating comparison, isn't it? And you're right. At first glance, they seem worlds apart.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the closer you look, the more you see these intriguing parallels, particularly in how they rose to power and consolidated control.
Right.
But of course, alongside those parallels are some stark differences that we definitely need to unpack.
Okay, let's do it. To set the stage for this deep dive, let's go back in time to the early 20th century. We're talking Germany between the world wars, a nation grappling with defeat and economic turmoil, and Cuba, simmering under U.S. influence. What were the key factors, the kindling, that ignited these revolutions in the first place?
You've hit the nail on the head with the word kindling.
Yeah.
Because it really was about pre-existing tensions and frustrations that these leaders were able to exploit. Germany, for example, was reeling from its defeat in World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, as you know, imposed these incredibly harsh penalties on Germany.
Yeah.
Reparations, territorial losses. It was a huge blow, not just economically, but psychologically. Imagine the collective sense of humiliation, the feeling of being punished for a generation before.
It's almost like the Treaty of Versailles itself became a breeding ground for resentment, creating fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root.
Precisely. And you see a similar dynamic, though not identical, playing out in Cuba. While not a direct result of war, Cuba was struggling under the weight of U.S. influence,
Right.
particularly the Platt Amendment.
Now, for those of us who might not be historians, remind us quickly what the Platt Amendment was all about and why it mattered so much to Cuba.
Essentially, the Platt Amendment, which the U.S. forced Cuba to adopt in 1901, gave America significant control over Cuban affairs. It limited Cuba's ability to make its own treaties, allowed the U.S. to intervene militarily whenever it saw fit, and even granted the U.S. a permanent naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Imagine another country having that kind of power over you, even after you've supposedly gained independence.
It's like a slap in the face, right? You think you're free, but you're still operating under someone else's thumb. So both countries are dealing with these feelings of powerlessness, of injustice. Germany wants to rise from the ashes, and Cuba wants to break free from this overbearing influence. And that's where our two protagonists enter the picture, Hitler in Germany and Castro in Cuba, each offering their own distinct brand of revolution.
And this is where the comparison gets really interesting, because we see two contrasting paths to power. Hitler through this Machiavellian maneuvering within the Weimar Republic,
Right.
and Castro through years of armed struggle in the mountains of Cuba. It really highlights how there's no single blueprint for a revolution.
Right, so let's unpack Hitler's rise first. From what I've read, he never actually won a majority of the vote, did he? So how on earth did he manage to become the leader of Germany?
It's a classic case, unfortunately, of exploiting a system from within. You see, the Weimar Republic, for all its flaws, was a democracy. Hitler and the Nazi Party, they were gaining some traction, appealing to this sense of national pride and frustration. But they never actually won a majority of the vote.
So how did he make the leap from a fringe politician to the Chancellor of Germany? There must be more to the story.
There is, and it's a cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy, especially in times of crisis. Conservative politicians, particularly Franz von Papen, saw the Nazis gaining popularity and made a grave miscalculation. They thought they could use Hitler, control him even, to achieve their own aims. They figured they could ride the tiger, so to speak.
Wow.
But they severely underestimated the danger.
Didn't they realize Hitler had his own agenda, his own ambitions?
It seems they either didn't fully grasp the extent of his ruthlessness, or they underestimated his political savvy. They believed they could control him, but as history tragically proved, they were sorely mistaken.
And that's how Hitler became chancellor in 1933, not through a popular mandate, but through this backroom dealing, this cynical calculation that ultimately backfired spectacularly.
Precisely. And once he was in a position of power, even if it wasn't through an outright majority, he moved swiftly and ruthlessly to consolidate his grip, dismantling the Weimar Republic from within. It's a chilling example of how quickly a democracy can be subverted, particularly when there's this perfect storm of economic hardship, social unrest, and political maneuvering.
It's a reminder that democracy is precious and fragile, something we need to actively safeguard. Now, Castro's rise to power in Cuba presents a stark contrast, doesn't it? We're not talking about manipulating a political system. We're talking about a full-blown revolution.
Absolutely. Castro's path to power was forged, not in the halls of government, but in the mountains of Cuba. He and his brother Raul, along with other revolutionaries like Che Guevara, spent years waging guerrilla warfare against the Batista regime. They were fighting for something they truly believed in.
Yeah.
For national liberation, for social justice.
And one of our sources mentions this incredibly powerful speech that Castro gave, the "History will absolve me" speech. It's almost like his own personal declaration of independence.
It became a rallying cry for the revolution. This wasn't just about toppling a dictator. It was about a complete transformation of Cuban society. He tapped into this deep well of resentment towards U.S. influence, towards economic inequality. He promised land redistribution, nationalization of industries, a break from the past. Imagine the fervor, the hope that ignited in the hearts of many Cubans who felt oppressed and ignored by the Batista regime.
So we have these two contrasting approaches to power. Hitler exploiting the legal framework of a democracy, and Castro leading this armed rebellion against an authoritarian regime. Both incredibly effective in their own ways, but through very different means.
And that raises a fascinating question, doesn't it? Which path to power is inherently more volatile, more dangerous? Is it the slow creep of authoritarianism within a seemingly democratic system? Or is it the explosive force of a revolution?
It's a question with no easy answers, that's for sure. And it gets even more complicated when we start to look at how each of these leaders, once they attained power, went about consolidating their control.
It's a crucial point because attaining power is one thing, right?
Yeah.
But holding on to it,
Right.
consolidating it,
Yeah.
often requires a whole different set of tactics.
Absolutely, and that's where this comparison between Hitler's Germany and Castro's Cuba takes another interesting turn. Because despite their very different paths to power, they both employed surprisingly similar tactics to silence opposition and maintain their grip on power.
You're right, the parallels are striking. Both regimes moved swiftly and decisively, though their targets, as you mentioned, were often quite different. But the underlying goal was the same: to neutralize any potential threats,
Right.
whether real or perceived.
And in Hitler's case, one of the most chilling examples of this consolidation of power was the Enabling Act of 1933. It's almost paradoxical because here you have this seemingly legal maneuver that essentially hands over dictatorial power to Hitler.
It's a stark reminder that democracies, for all their strengths, are not immune to manipulation from within. The Enabling Act effectively allowed Hitler to bypass the Reichstag.
Right, the German parliament.
Yeah, the German parliament, giving him the power to enact laws without their consent. It was a crucial step in dismantling the Weimar Republic and solidifying Nazi control.
It's terrifying how quickly a system designed to protect individual rights and freedoms can be turned on its head, especially when fear and uncertainty are running high.
Precisely. And the Nazis were masters at exploiting these emotions, creating this atmosphere of crisis, and then presenting themselves as the only ones who could restore order. But what's equally disturbing is that this wasn't just about silencing opposition outside of the Nazi Party.
Yeah.
Hitler was also consolidating his power from within.
You're talking about the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, right? When Hitler purged his own party of potential rivals.
Exactly.
Including Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA.
Exactly. The Night of the Long Knives was a brutal demonstration of Hitler's ruthlessness, even towards those within his own ranks. He saw Röhm and the SA as a threat to his authority, so he eliminated them. It was a calculated move to consolidate his power over the military and eliminate anyone who might challenge his leadership.
It paints a chilling picture of paranoia, ambition, and the lengths to which Hitler was willing to go to secure his power. Now, Castro also went after his opponents, but his approach seems to have been more focused outward, wouldn't you say?
That's a key distinction. While Hitler was purging rivals within his own party, Castro was more concerned with rooting out remnants of the Batista regime, perceived counter-revolutionaries, and anyone suspected of being pro-American. He saw these groups as obstacles to his vision of a socialist Cuba, threats to the revolution he had fought so hard to achieve.
And one of the key instruments he used to achieve this was the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, or the CDR, as it's often called. It sounds almost innocuous on the surface, but it was anything but, right?
Not at all. The CDR was essentially Castro's apparatus for mass surveillance and social control. They were present in every neighborhood, keeping tabs on people, reporting on any activity deemed suspicious or critical of the regime. This created a pervasive atmosphere of self-censorship, where people were afraid to speak out against the government, even in private.
So while Hitler's Germany and Castro's Cuba had very different ideological underpinnings, they both ended up with these incredibly similar systems of control.
Yeah.
One-party rule, suppression of dissent, and this constant sense of being watched.
Yes, and that's where propaganda comes in, because it wasn't enough to simply control people through force and intimidation. Both regimes understood the power of shaping the narrative,
Right.
of controlling information, of molding the hearts and minds of the populace.
And they were both incredibly adept at using propaganda to their advantage, though their messaging and tactics were tailored to their specific contexts and goals. With Hitler, it was all about this myth of Aryan supremacy, this dangerous cocktail of nationalism and racism.
The Nazis were masters of scapegoating, of exploiting pre-existing prejudices and fears. They blamed Germany's problems on Jews, communists, intellectuals, anyone deemed other or a threat to their vision of a racially pure Germany. And they used every tool at their disposal to spread this message: radio, film, newspapers, massive rallies.
This went far beyond just words. The Nuremberg Laws, enacted in 1935, stripped Jewish people of their citizenship and rights, legalizing discrimination and persecution. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly hate speech can become codified in law.
The Nuremberg Laws were a turning point, a clear escalation from propaganda to state-sanctioned persecution. And it's a chilling reminder, as you said, of how dangerous words can be, how easily they can be used to incite hatred and justify violence.
No, Castro's propaganda, at least on the surface, had a very different tone, didn't it? It was more about hope and progress, about creating this socialist utopia free from American imperialism.
Exactly. Castro was a master at tapping into this wellspring of resentment towards the U.S. that had been simmering in Cuba for decades. He framed the revolution as a victory for the Cuban people, a chance to finally control their own destiny, to build a more just and equitable society.
And to be fair, he did implement some significant social reforms, particularly in healthcare and education. Literacy rates soared and access to healthcare dramatically improved for many Cubans, particularly those in rural areas who had been neglected under previous regimes.
You're right, those social reforms were a key part of his propaganda strategy. By delivering tangible improvements to people's lives, particularly the poor and marginalized, he was able to garner genuine support for the revolution and legitimize his regime, at least in the eyes of many Cubans.
So it's interesting to see how these two leaders, despite their different ideologies and contexts, both understood that control wasn't just about brute force. It was also about shaping perceptions, about winning hearts and minds, about getting people to buy into the system, even if it meant overlooking or justifying its darker aspects.
Precisely. It's a reminder that propaganda, even in its most insidious forms, is often wrapped in a veneer of hope, of progress, of national unity. And that's what makes it so dangerous.
Yeah, it makes you think, how easily we can all be manipulated, how important it is to really think for ourselves.
Absolutely. And you know what's scary is it's not just a thing of the past, right?
Right.
The techniques employed by regimes like Hitler's Germany and Castro's Cuba,
Yeah.
they're still very much with us today.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they often take on their different forms.
That's right. We see it in the rise of misinformation and disinformation online, the use of social media to manipulate public opinion, the polarization of political discourse. It's more important than ever to be media literate, to be critical thinkers, to question the information we're consuming.
I couldn't agree more. And that's where understanding history becomes so crucial.
Right.
Because it's not just about, memorizing dates and names.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing patterns.
Right.
About understanding how seemingly small compromises can lead to much larger consequences.
Right.
It's about asking ourselves those tough questions like, what led to these regimes taking root? How did they maintain their grip on power for so long? And most importantly, how can we prevent such tragedies from happening again?
It's like that old saying, right? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
But even when we do remember the past, even when we study these regimes and try to understand them, there's always room for debate, right? For different interpretations of history.
Absolutely. History isn't like, a monolith.
Right.
It's an ongoing conversation, a tapestry woven from multiple perspectives.
Right.
Take Hitler's Germany, for example. Historians have been debating for decades the factors that led to the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust, some known as intentionalists.
Right.
They emphasize Hitler's individual role, his ideology, his hatred, arguing that he was the driving force behind these atrocities.
It's almost like the great man theory of history, right? That these larger-than-life figures kind of shape the course of events through their sheer will and determination.
Exactly. But then you have other historians, the structuralists,
Yeah.
who argue that focusing solely on Hitler's intentions ignores the broader context, right? They point to the economic and social conditions in Germany after World War I, the political instability, the weakness of the Weimar Republic, the widespread anti-Semitism that predated Hitler's rise.
Right.
They argue that these factors created fertile ground for someone like Hitler to exploit, that he was as much a product of his time as he was a shaper of it.
So it's not an either situation. It's about understanding the interplay of individual actions and broader historical forces.
Precisely. And we see a similar debate surrounding Castro's Cuba.
Oh,
Marxist historians, for example, view his revolution as an inevitable consequence of class struggle, of the inherent contradictions of capitalism.
right.
They argue that U.S. imperialism and the exploitation of Cuban workers created the conditions for revolution.
Right. But then you have other historians who argue that Castro's embrace of communism and his close ties with the Soviet Union were more about consolidating his own power
Right.
than about liberating the Cuban people.
Exactly.
They point to the suppression of dissent, the persecution of political opponents, the restrictions on individual freedoms that characterized his regime.
Again, it's about recognizing the complexities, the nuances, the different perspectives that shape our understanding of history.
Right.
And it's not about taking sides or saying one interpretation is inherently right or wrong.
Right.
It's about engaging with these different viewpoints, weighing the evidence, and forming our own informed conclusions.
It's about understanding that history isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's a living, breathing thing that continues to shape our world today.
Exactly. And as we've seen with this deep dive into Hitler's Germany and Castro's Cuba,
Yeah.
it's also a powerful reminder that the choices we make, the ideas we embrace, the systems we create or fail to challenge,
Right.
they all have consequences,
Yeah.
both intended and unintended.
It's a lot to ponder, that's for sure. From, backroom political maneuvering to armed revolution, from the horrors of the Holocaust to the complexities of the Cuban Revolution. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. But I think if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that history is never truly over, is it?
Never.
It's alive in the world around us, shaping our present and our future.
Shaping our present and our future.
So listeners, as you go about your day, think about the lessons we've discussed. What echoes of these historical patterns do you see in the world today? What can we learn from the mistakes of the past to create a better future? Keep those critical thinking caps on, and until next time, happy exploring.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.